Welcome to the final module of global politics. Today we're going to be talking about green theories, or how ecology or environmental concerns meet IR theories, and sort of what do they tell about the future of international relations. In this module, we're going to begin by discussing two separate understandings of nature. First, nature as a resource, but also nature as an ecosystem that humans are part of. So how do we sort of engage with that? And then we're going to focus on a particular kind of understanding of nature versus humanity, the sort of the dualism that defines modernity, and how that differs from ecological thought. Then we're going to talk about green theory in international relations, and then conclude with some concluding remarks. Let's start with a particular puzzle, which is that as humans, we create a great deal of garbage, a great deal of trash. And then what do we do with it on a global scale? How do we think about production in relation to garbage? And then how do we think about garbage in relation to production? How do we think about those two sides of the same coin? But before we can do that, let's ask ourselves a particular question, which is that what is nature? How do we understand nature? How does our understanding of international relations fit vis-a-vis our understanding of nature and Earth, and how those two ideas come together? In this lecture, one of the things that we're going to look at is this singular understanding that Earth is a closed ecosystem, is that there's only so much that we can do with Earth. There's only so much resources, there's only so much space, there's only so much nurture for us to sort of rely on as part of our environment. For the most part, when we think of nature, we think of this romanticized idea of a beautiful forest or a natural park, or sort of, green space and untouched beauty. But nature has multiple manifestations. Even a garbage dump could be nature, in the sense that it was at some point that pristine idea of nature, and that today a garbage dump is still part of nature because it interacts with its surroundings. And that's something important to understand about garbage in relation to the nature, in the sense that sort of it is part of nature. It is part of the afterlife of things that we talked about in this class, about trade, about production, about war, about peace. It is important to understand that we can't just ignore trash. At the same time, however, this pristine waterfall is also nature. The thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that these ideas overlap, these ideas interact with each other, in the sense that there is a continuum, that this is used or is sort of operationalized to make an understanding of nature. But at the same time, we can't ignore that nature has human components. This is a picture of the Canadian tar sands, the sort of perhaps the most contentious parts of the Canadian economy, in that we rely on the resources of the tar sands, the financial, the energy-wise, etc. But at the same time, it comes at a huge environmental cost, a huge environmental cost that is difficult to sort of justify at times, both financially and environmentally. We must ask ourselves a simple question. Is there an ethical or a moral dilemma in using nature as a resource? That we can look at nature multiple ways. We can use, once again, nature as something that we're part of, an ecosystem that sort of humans take part in, or we can also sort of start seeing it as a resource, that we can see it as as an energy source, or as a source for raw materials, or as a source for subsistence. It's most of the things that we rely on a day in, day out basis comes from the nature. But then we can, if we overemphasize that part of nature as a resource, then perhaps we start ignoring the fact that we are also organisms that live in nature, and as part of it, that if we keep using it as a sort of an infinite resource, then we'll very quickly hit the finite limits of those resources. In terms of international relations, a particular problem that stems out of global environmental problems is that environment is not something that we can contain within borders or boundaries of Westphalian systems, in the sense that borders don't apply to environmental disasters. Borders don't apply to environmental problems. That we can't simply limit garbage within national boundaries, or we can't sort of limit or contain air pollution or water pollution within national boundaries. So the borders that are designed to keep humans or sort of human artifacts like trade or migration, etc., are not effective in keeping environmental problems out of national boundaries. So as a result, what we see is this sort of perpetual challenge or a perpetual sort of task of trying to deal with environmental problems. So environmental issues do tend to lend themselves naturally to the question of global governance that we've talked about in this class. Inside the state, governments have different ways of regulating environment. So they can have regulations like environmental laws, environmental standards, or creating agencies that provide oversight on environmental issues like, water, air pollution, dealing with natural resources, but most of it is still sort of looking at the environment as a resource. Then the question, or sort of innovative policies like polluter pays, where different factories or different actors who pollute more pay more in relation to taxes, or emission quotas that create a carbon emission market, which different actors can sort of choose to pay more or get paid more depending on how much emissions they put into the atmosphere or how much pollution they put into water streams, etc. And that's one way of dealing with environmental regulations. And most countries do have certain environmental standards that they try to abide by. For the reasons we've discussed in this class, at the international level, the environmental policies become more difficult because, once again, we live in a Westphalian world order where sovereignty reigns supreme, meaning that states have the final say on what other states can or cannot do in relation to national domestic territories. So international community might have certain aspirations about how to address global climate change, but if the individual states don't subscribe to those conventions, don't subscribe to those norms, then it becomes difficult or impossible in many ways to establish a global regime of environmental regulation. So regulations at the international level are usually non-binding. As we talked about in this class, international laws are often not applicable or voluntarily applicable to states. We can develop standards, but standards are usually sort of pushed by the consumers or the producers. And there is oversight. So there is the UN Environmental Program or treaties like the Kyoto Treaty or the Paris treaties that are there to sort of designed to sort of oversee emissions reduction towards a sort of a more sustained climate change response. But what we see, for example, with countries like the United States or Canada is that they can voluntarily opt in or opt out of these treaties. And if a country like the United States opts out of the Paris Treaty, it does have huge ramifications for the rest of the people, or the rest of the countries that are part of that treaty, because it means that the world's largest economy is no longer committing to those climate goals. So if everyone is pushing for one kind of environmental policy, but a major actor pulls out or changes direction, then it means that sort of either that's creating an unfair advantage for that country, or it means that the global regime is no longer sustainable. Oftentimes in international relations, polluters do not pay, and emission quotas are seen as an undermining factor towards development. So what do I mean by that? We can look at emission quotas in two ways. So under the Kyoto and Paris protocols, the aspiration or the goal is to reduce emission targets or global emission levels to the levels that we had in the 1990s. The idea being there that the Earth has reached an industrial development around 1990s that was sustainable, environmentally speaking, or at least more sustainable than what we have right now. But what the developing countries are arguing is that in the 1990s, it also meant that the developing countries had huge gains over them. So meaning that if we go back to the 90s, it would mean that the developing countries would have to cut down their development and would perpetuate the sort of inequalities that we had globally. in the name of maintaining an environmental regime that they feel that they're not the ones to be blamed for. So the global South, countries in the global South, are arguing that they're not the ones that caused global climate change. So the key here is perhaps this pretense that we can only address global environmental problems globally, that the national responses will not be successful in addressing the scale or the size of the problem, that individual countries might have the best aspirations or best policies, but without a global response, it is rather difficult to speak of a possibility for an individual country to address all of these problems. There's a certain kind of intellectual background to our relationship with the nature. And this is perhaps stemming from a modernity approach to understanding humans in relation to their environment. There's this sort of hubris that humans are different than every other species, or that different in that they have mastered ways to control nature. So dualistic thought that most of the ways in which we engage with the environment today operates is that it makes a central ethical distinction between humans and nature, meaning that humans are more important, that it sees humans as the atomic concept, as a central concept around which everything else is structured around. And this is, in the literature, is referred to as an anthropocentric belief, that this kind of approach believes that humankind is the most important or central species on Earth, and it often sees nature as a resource for humans. So there's air, water, source of energy, food. Things in nature become designed or become geared towards supplying the needs of the humankind. Alternatively, ecological thought makes no distinction between humans and nature, argues that humans are, in essence, part of the natural ecology of things. That this is, in fact, a holistic concept that doesn't make this sort of binary distinction between humans and others or humans and nature, but it argues or it believes that humans are part of nature. That this is not anthropocentric, but rather ecocentric, in that ecological concerns should, over and above human concerns, be central to the decisions about right or wrong behavior about nature. So it doesn't see nature as a resource, but rather sees nature as our habitat. This particular approach has a certain way of informing international relations theory. So when we look at some of the more pressing issues that is facing humanity right now, like climate change, green theory proposes something that moves beyond the theories that we've talked about so far. So one might argue that green theory, in its essence, is perhaps a sort of theory that poses a profound challenge for all the theories that we learned so far, in that perhaps questions like realpolitik, of idealism, etc., are not ways that we have the luxury to think about the world anymore, that we cannot sort of think about realpolitik or national interest or sovereignty when we have global scale catastrophes waiting for us around the corner or sort of unfolding in front of our eyes. A core premise of green theory is that Earth is a closed system. It's a closed ecosystem. There's only so much that the Earth can produce. And if we keep exploiting Earth as we do it and not treat it like a habitat, but treat it like a resource, then soon enough we will reach a tipping point where we can no longer enjoy the life that we have. I am not someone that is going to sort of show you both sides of the climate change debate. I don't see it as being a debate. The approach that I have to this is simple. As students of international relations or as students of politics, your job is to look at the facts. And if someone's saying it's raining outside and if someone is saying it's not raining outside, your job is not to sort of say, well, there are two perspectives, one saying it's raining outside, the other saying it's not raining outside. Your job is to look at the facts and figure out, by looking outside or by looking at the facts, so to speak, and tell the audience what is happening. Is it raining? Is it not raining? So in relation to climate change, my job is not to sort of say, well, there are two opposing views on climate change. One is arguing this, the other one's arguing this. there's an overwhelming scientific consensus. And the way in which science works is that science works in a way that scientific paradigms are true until proven to be not true. And so far, we do not have any evidence that the scientific consensus is not true in relation to climate change. So climate change is not about the world is getting hotter, warmer, colder, whatnot. It's about a significant and lasting change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns. So there might be a change in average weather conditions or in the distribution of weather around the average conditions. And what we see with climate change, although Earth has been through numerous periods of climate change, what we see with this particular epoch of climate change is that we are entering a period called the Anthropocene, where the sort of speed and the direction of climate change is being informed or is being shaped by human life on Earth. So what we see as a result is a global problem that can be seen as either post or pre-Westphalian, in the sense that sovereignty or the sovereign paradigms are incapable or not designed to address. Globally, what we see is a decline in the glacier thickness, in the sense that sort of the pockets that contain most of the fresh water on Earth is sort of getting depleted by sort of a global warm-up, which then has subsequent effects on salination, acidity of the ocean, as well as an effect on the air and ocean currents that cool or warm the Earth. A good example for a problem that is post-Westphalian but climate change affected by climate change is the pine beetle infestation on the west coast of North America. So pine beetles have existed for a long time, but the pine beetle infestation in the Pacific Northwest is increasing precisely because the winters are no longer getting as cold as they used to. So the pine beetles are no longer dying. So they can sort of nestle inside trees and maintain themselves over winter, meaning that their population is not declining but increasing, and that has a huge impact on the both the sort of the forest and the health of the forest, but also in the sort of the more human economical terms, it has impact on the lumber industries of the Pacific Northwest, which is a major industry for those regions of the world. Environmental problems that we talked about so far, and we will talk about in a second, often have global consequences. That they're not, as I've been arguing, they're not containable inside national boundaries. A good example of that is the Danube River in Europe. Danube River is the longest river in Europe, and it starts somewhere in sort of southern Germany and goes all the way to Romania, and then sort of spills into the Black Sea, which is an inland sea. But it goes through a number of countries. It goes through Germany, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the sort of subsidiary rivers also go through a number of other countries. So what you see is there's an inequality, or there's a problem here. If the countries upstream don't regulate what they put into the river, countries downstream will have to deal with the pollution, because the river is sort of a continuous water source, and it does not sort of stop one way or the other. Even if the countries downstream are not putting any pollution into the river, if the countries upstream don't regulate that, then there's a problem. So if we go back to what we talked about in the last module about European integration, we will notice that most of these countries are not European Union countries. So European Union has developed particular instruments to oversee or sort of manage the issues associated with river pollution. So it's been pretty helpful in creating an environment where the Danube River is now healthy and clean, precisely because of the regulations surrounding what can or cannot be put in the river. Similarly, the North American air pollution problem is something that cannot be sort of contained within the national boundaries of the United States or Canada. That's historically in the sort of 80s and 90s, the northeast corridor of the United States have instances of acid rain precisely because of the amount of chemicals that was being put into the atmosphere. Now, through regulation and at the North American level regulation, we have developed ways to sort of overcome the acid rain problem, but that has happened through regulation, and oftentimes it has happened through international regulation or sort of regional cooperation among the North American countries. Another example of a global environmental disaster is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear fallout. So, following the earthquake in Japan, the sort of and the explosion at the Fukushima nuclear power plant, what we had was a sort of nuclear fallout into the Pacific Ocean and into the atmosphere that within 10 days reached the west coast of the United States and continues to sort of have an impact on the quality of water and air pollution in the Pacific Rim. So this is important to understand that we can't, like an environmental disaster like a nuclear fallout in Japan is not something that just exclusively impacts Japan, that it impacts most of the Pacific. And the same is true about the Great Pacific Plastic Patch, that it's not something that just happens in that particular region or in that particular sort of area. But if you keep throwing plastic into the ocean, or if the plastic seeps into the ocean, then eventually it has global consequences. The problem that we have is simple, and it's actually a very old problem. Environment represents a global commons, and commons is a term that stems from English countryside. So it refers to the cultural and natural resource accessible to all members of a society, including natural materials such as air, water, and habitable earth. So commons refers historically to these areas and villages owned collectively or by one person, but over which other people have traditional rights to allow their livestock to graze upon, to collect firewood, or cut turf for fuel. Now, it's a collective space, but because it's a collective space and not necessarily owned by or have exclusive rights to one person, and if everyone's using it but no one's taking ownership, then what we have is something called the tragedy of the commons. This is an example of what a commons look like, with pigs eating through the commons, or the vegetation in the commons. Tragedy of the commons refers to the depletion of a shared resource by individuals, rationally according to self-interest, despite their understanding that depleting the common resource is contrary to the group's long-term best interest. So imagine that you are a herder of, let's say, sheep or goats or whatever, and you know that if you graze your animals in the same common every day, all the time, sure, in the short term that it fulfills your rational interest that your animals are well fed. But you're also understanding that by doing that repeatedly day after day, that you are eliminating the vegetation on that particular common, meaning that in the long term there'll no longer be grounds for your animals. So what you would normally do if you owned your own land, you would move your herd around the territory so that they can they can graze in a sort of a cyclical way, where as they're moving forward, moving around the land, they will be sort of eating in different parts of the land so that the other parts that they have eaten would have time to sort of recover. But because we're rational or self-interested actors, what we're doing is we're looking for that moment. And this is the same case with the environment, that for short-term gains, global actors, states, corporations, whatnot, are depleting resources around the world to gain that sort of short-term relative advantage without much sort of thought about the long-term consequences. So our basic needs are dependent on environmental sustainability. Things like air, water, land, etc. are all global common. But things like peak oil, toxic waste, emission rates, downriver pollution, these are the kind of things that we do, and they don't necessarily recognize national sovereignty or jurisdiction. So as a result, if you want to do it, you can, without sort of any short-term or without limited short-term consequences. But in the long term, everybody pays for the price. As such, the environment represents an instance of global tragedy of the commons. To understand what I mean, let's look at a beach in Bangladesh called the Chittagong Beach. This is where the most of the, or a sizable portion of the globe's super tankers get dismantled. And it's a very dirty business. It's a very dangerous business, but it's sort of the recycling process, or the sort of the life of that ship ends there. And what begins is a recycling process that then sort of goes on to fuel the economies of Bangladesh and India for natural resources. So if you go online and search Chittagong Beach, what you will find is this sort of set of videos that shows how these massive ships get dismantled. And it's a fascinating process, and it's a sort of a it's what recycling really looks like, sort of quote unquote recycling looks like, because these ships are being sold to the highest bidder who wants to pay so that they can get the metal in those ships. But then most of these ships are covered in asbestos, so the cancer rates on those beaches are high as anywhere else in the world. And the average life expectation of people working there is also extremely low, because this is very dangerous work, and these people are doing them at the lowest possible pay and without any kind of safety or environmental regulation. So on the one hand, we might look at this as a question of market failure, saying that sort of market does not care for the environment, market has no long-term sight. But what we're seeing is almost 50% of world supertankers get disassembled in Bangladesh, and in particular in that particular beach in Chittagong. And 80% of Bangladesh's steel and 33% of India's steel. And these are massive global markets in terms of sort of industrial production, come from the tankers that are recycled or disassembled on those beaches. And this is a huge job opportunity, or an employment market, that almost 100 to 200,000 jobs, depending on the season, are there in that beach. But the reason why it is there is because in Bangladesh, a person could be paid something like $1 to $2 a day, versus a comparative of $2 to $8 in India a day, versus $35 to $40 per hour in the United States. So there's a reason why these ships don't get dismantled in the United States. The environmental, the safety, the union regulations in these countries mean that the jobs don't come to North America. And the way that it is done in Bangladesh is that it's dangerous, it's unregulated, it's unsafe, versus in the United States, where it's regulated, it's safe, it's paid well. And what you see is sort of somewhere between 300 to 350 deaths a year on a single beach alone, because once again, it's not an environment where the primary concern is the safety of the individual, or the health of the environment. It's the primary concern is to make the most amount of profit for the steel that then gets recycled from the supertankers. And in essence, this is the core puzzle, that we have a challenge. The challenge is, should we focus on economic or rational logic, or should we focus on ecological or green logic? That should our primary concern be making the most amount of profit vis-a-vis, or in relation to, the recycling of the ships, which in itself, by the way, is somewhat of a green industry, because they're recycling these ships, they're recycling the metal from the ships. But it is not an ecological process, in the sense that they're not doing it with a primary concern of the environment in mind. What they're doing is they're doing it with the economic concerns primarily in mind. And this is a paradox. This is a paradox that defines most of our discussion, if not all of our discussion about the environment. This defines our discussion of climate change. This defines our discussion of pollution. Who pays? How do we solve this? How do we mitigate its impact on economy? Now, the response, unfortunately, is not a positive one, in the sense that there's very little we can do unless we're going to create economic responses or we're going to create new economic solutions to environmental issues. So we can sort of monetize or financialize the environmental issues. And that's one way that we've been going about, by creating, quote unquote, a green economy. But in reality, what we're seeing is that maybe it's sort of not working. Maybe we have to rethink the way we live financially or economically to change it. So Keep in mind this particular puzzle or particular tension between economics and ecology. So to go back to our core premise that Earth is a closed ecosystem, there are two ways of thinking about this. There is, on the one hand, there are the cornucopians who believe that we will find new resources that meet our needs and find solutions to the problems of waste and pollution. So they believe that technology will prevent solutions. And there's others, the Malthusians, who believe that resources are finite and grow at a slow rate than population. So the population increase happens at a faster rate than the Earth's ability to regenerate resources. So eventually, what will happen is a catastrophic failure of proportions, where large chunks of the population will suffer. To give you an example of how that sort of population increase versus resource depletion happen at a rate, we can look at the example of peak oil. And peak oil refers to a time when the maximum rate of petroleum extraction is reached, after which the rate of production is expected to enter a terminal decline. This is called the Hubbard peak, and the idea is that we've already reached Hubbard peak in the sense that the available oil in sort of the easily extractable format, that is not tar sands and whatnot, we've already reached the maximum amount. That from now on, we have to find more and more sort of dangerous methods of extracting oil that has more and more environmental impact. So what we'll see is that most likely the oil prices will not go down anymore. They will sort of regularly or sort of historically will increase time and time again. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that somewhere around 2000s, we supposedly reached the sort of Hubbard peak, but what we see is perhaps sort of like the argument might be that it wasn't sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, but like we're sort of somewhere in the middle of reaching or arriving at the Hubbard peak. And what you'll see is that gradually sort of we will not have the oil resources that we have. So some of perhaps the opposition that you see to building pipelines, etc., is stemming from this. Is that sort of we're putting a lot of investment into, in many ways, in sort of a disappearing resource. And remember once again that the Earth is a closed system. That once we deplete the resources of oil, then we no longer have oil. So then there's two, the cornucopian versus Malthusian argument. The Malthusians would argue that if we can't change, if we can't adapt to that, then we will suffer, that we will no longer have energy, we will no longer have the resources that we have, and it will have an impact on population. And the cornucopians would argue that we will develop new technologies that will then sort of bypass the particular problem that we have as a result of the disappearance of fossil fuels. And cornucopians argue that we can adapt, that we can sort of change, we can develop new technologies, and we can sort of find new ways. We can find new ways such as wind turbines. We can find new ways such as tidal energy production. Or we can rely on solar energy. If you look at this map, what you see is the amount of surface area required to power the world with solar energy, which is zero carbon emissions. And you'll see that there's only small pieces of land that we can use to sort of provide energy to the world. But we can also say, can we really adapt? Like, can we really change? Can we really find a way to sort of solve these problems? Because what we're seeing also that there's also a level of a set of problems that stem from issues like environmental change, or the sort of pace of environmental change that is making it difficult for us to develop. So sometimes what we have is technological responses create new challenges, which then we have to find solutions for. Let's take one example of such a situation where a particular response to an environmental problem resulted in creating another problem, which then we had to get creative and find a solution for. And that's the water reservoir situation in Los Angeles. So Department of Water Protection in LA detected high levels of a chemical called bromate, a carcinogen that forms when bromide and chlorine react with sunlight. So those are the two things that people put, or sort of the LA was adding into the water. So chlorine was something that was added into the water to sort of make the water clean because of the sort of issues of water getting polluted. And bromide was something that was already in the sort of, was in the way in which the reservoir was designed. So the reservoir is a concrete reservoir, and sort of the material of bromide seeps through from the concrete. So this 102-year-old facility serves about 600,000 customers in downtown and South Los Angeles, which is already an underdeveloped part of the city. And the new underground reserve takes a long time, and while it's still under construction, it means that people who live in that part of the city were getting exposed to highly carcinogenic water. So the short-term solution was adding plastic balls to the water or the water reserve. So in this slide, you see workers of the city of Los Angeles, covering the water reserve with plastic balls, black plastic balls, so that block sunlight. And in the end, this is what the reserve looked like. That sort of it's a water reservoir that is fully covered with plastic balls, so that the water doesn't get exposed to sunlight. As a result, then the chemical does not get, or the sort of bromate does not get added to the water, because of the chemical reaction doesn't take place between the sunlight and chlorine and bromide. Now, this is a task that happened in a developed country with resources. What we see is around the world, such problems start emerging more and more frequently, and in sort of a more rapid pace. So time is in many ways, right? The effects of climate change, the effects of environmental degradation is becoming too high for us to assume that sort of nature will run its course. So in international relations, a way to think about that is what's called the green theory. And it's a rejection of anthropocentric worldviews that sort of argues that humans are at the center of the environmental relations, and that sort of they have a privileged position. Green theory rejects this. They also argue that human interference is threatening the survival of all species on Earth, and that we need to fundamentally change the social, economic, and technological structures and ideological and value systems, and that there needs to be a distinction between vital and non-vital needs. Another contribution of green theory is that it's the rejection of the development strategies that encourage economic growth over quality of life or environmental sustainability. That in effect, this is an ethics based on green theory of value, which places an intrinsic value on non-human life, or life in general outside or including human life. That it argues that we need to pay attention to the life of the environment, the sustainability of the environment, more so than profit schemes and economic development. So the core assumption of green theory is that it emphasizes the global over the international, that it focuses on a cosmopolitan idea of the world that does not subscribe to the Westphalian understandings of sovereignty and borders. The problem, or the sort of the thing that they're trying to point out here, is that there are no Westphalian solutions to global problems, that there are no Westphalian solutions to environmental catastrophes, that human practices are in many ways out of sync with the non-human world, that the environment does not gel, to quote unquote, gel with the sort of the international order that the humans have developed around the Westphalian order. That modern practices, underpinned by anthropocentric philosophical belief of human nature duality, have been essential or central or critical in causing the environmental crisis that we're living through. So that the solutions will not come through that. So their proposed idea, obviously, is a normative theory that we have to rethink the way in which we've been doing things. We've been doing economy, we've been doing society, we've been doing state. So green theorists propose an understanding of security that is not based on national security, that is not based on resource security, that is not based on, societal security. It is based on environmental security. It's based on human security. So it's a combination of our understandings of human security that puts humans at the center of discussions of security, and environment as something that humans are part of but not outside of. So when green theorists talk about security, they're talking about a more wholesome understanding of security than the liberals or the realists or the Marxists talk about it. And the kind of economics that green theorists talk about is also different than perhaps some of the theories that we talked about, because they're not talking about an economics where the idea is profit, the idea is development, the idea is increasing the market share. The kind of economy that they're talking about is that we profoundly rethink what we consider to be development, that we profoundly rethink what we consider to be a sustainable lifestyle. And their core argument is the sort of the consumerist approach that we have to the environment, to the economy, isn't sustainable. That as species, we do not need 5-bedroom houses with 3-car garages and 4 cars and etc. That kind of consumerist lifestyle is only sustainable through the exploitation of nature and exploitation of other humans. That if we try to sort of approach it in a way that how can we have a sustainable lifestyle that can be emulated or reproduced around the world for everyone, we come to the conclusion pretty quickly that the lifestyle that we have right now in North America or Western Europe is obviously not a sustainable lifestyle for the rest of the world. So they propose us to sort of rethink our means, rethink the question of sustainability, take that question of sustainability in regards to economics really seriously. So if we were to reflect on the conclusions of green theory, what the core is that for green theorists, the point is that we need to add the environment, and in particular environmental sustainability, in our analysis. They argue that this will, and this has, enriched our analysis. So they're pushing us to move beyond anthropocentrism, move beyond the level of analysis or levels of analysis that focus on global, national, international, local, etc., and think ecologies of analysis, think continuums of analysis. Focus on the human-nature relationship as much as the human-human relationship. So rather than just focusing on how states interact with each other or how humans interact with each other, we should also pay attention to how humans interact with their surroundings. And that this requires a restructuring of various systems, institutions, and more importantly, this requires radical action. That the way in which that we live our lives is obviously not sustainable in environmental sense. And if we destroy the environment for green theorists, and there is nothing else left, that there will be no more conversation of economic development, a sort of conversation about national security. All of these things are dependent on a particular norm, a norm that we've enjoyed, a sort of a climate norm that we've enjoyed. But as that norm gets destabilized, as the climate changes, the things that we are able to enjoy will no longer become the normal, but the norm. So we have to adjust to the new norms. And they're arguing that if we don't do it in a way that it focuses on the environment as the core pillar, then we will destroy the civilization. So I have a double question for the final essay for this class. And the question is, are environmental problems technical or political in nature? And how should we respond to the pressing environmental problems? I hope that you learned something from global politics. If you have any questions about this slide, this deck of slides, or this module, or any other module, please do not hesitate to contact me. And thank you for taking this class.